There are people you forget almost immediately. You meet them, you talk for a while, maybe you even spend months around them. And then one day they simply become part of the background of your life. And then there are other people, they leave, and somehow they stay, you hear a song and think of them. You pass a familiar place and remember something they said. You see their name unexpectedly, and for a second, your mind takes you back to a completely different moment in your life. Sometimes you haven't spoken to them in months, maybe even years, and yet they are still there in the strange little corners of your memory. The interesting part is that it usually isn't because they were the most beautiful person in the room. It isn't because they talked the most. It isn't even because they were always kind. Sometimes the people we remember most clearly are the ones who made us feel something we couldn't easily explain. And that's where human memory becomes much more interesting. Because people don't always remember what happened. They remember how they felt while it was happening. Think about someone from your past who still occasionally crosses your mind. Maybe it was a friend, maybe someone you loved, maybe someone you almost had something with. Maybe it was simply a person you met for a short period of time, but somehow they left a deeper impression than people you've known for years. Now ask yourself something. What exactly made them memorable? Was it their voice, their face, their personality, or was it something that happened inside you when you were around them? Because sometimes the person isn't what your mind keeps returning to. It's the version of yourself that existed when they were there, and that distinction changes everything. We often assume that being remembered requires doing something extraordinary. We think memorable people are the loud ones, the charismatic ones, the people who enter a room and immediately demand attention. But that's not always how memory works. Some of the most unforgettable people are actually quiet. They don't constantly tell you how interesting they are. They don't chase attention. They don't try to make every conversation about themselves. They simply leave behind an emotional impression. And when they eventually disappear from your everyday life, your mind notices the absence. That's the first important piece of this. Presence can become invisible when it is always available. But absence makes the mind compare. When someone is always there, your brain gradually becomes familiar with them. Their messages become normal, their voice becomes normal. Their attention becomes normal. Even their little habits become normal. And the human brain is extremely good at adapting to what it repeatedly experiences. But when that person suddenly isn't there anymore, the pattern breaks, and your mind notices. You might not consciously say, I miss this person. Instead, you simply notice that something feels different. The conversation isn't the same. The room feels slightly quieter. You reach for your phone and realize there is no message from them. You walk past the place where you used to meet, and suddenly something that seemed ordinary becomes meaningful. This is one reason leaving can sometimes make a person more noticeable than staying ever did. Not because absence magically makes someone valuable, but because absence removes the constant stimulation that had become familiar. And once the stimulation disappears, the mind has space to evaluate what it meant. Think about the last time you stopped hearing from someone you were used to hearing from. At first, you may have felt relief. Maybe you thought it's probably for the best. You continued with your life, you went to work, you talked to other people, you laughed, you got busy. And then unexpectedly something reminded you of them. Not because you were deliberately thinking about them, because memory works through associations, a smell, a song, a phrase, a location. A particular time of day, even a certain type of weather, one small detail can open an entire emotional file in your mind. And suddenly someone who wasn't in your thoughts 5 minutes ago is standing there mentally as if they never left. That's how powerful emotional associations can be, but there is something deeper. People tend to remember experiences that feel unfinished. When everything is clearly explained, clearly resolved, and emotionally complete, the mind has less reason to keep revisiting it. But when something ends without a perfect conclusion, the mind sometimes keeps returning to it, not necessarily because the person was your soulmate. Not because the relationship was destined to continue, sometimes simply because there was no satisfying ending. There was something you wanted to say, something you wanted to understand. Something you never got to ask, something you thought might happen, but didn't, and the human mind doesn't always like unfinished stories. That's why a short interaction can sometimes stay with you longer than an entire relationship. A person can enter your life for 3 months and remain in your thoughts for 3 years. Not because 3 months were more important than 3 years, but because those 3 months contained something your mind never fully resolved. Maybe they made you feel seen at a time when you desperately wanted to be understood. Maybe they challenged you. Maybe they made you question yourself. Maybe they showed you a side of yourself you hadn't noticed before, or maybe you simply never got to find out what could have happened. And sometimes, the mystery becomes part of the memory. This is why being memorable isn't the same thing as being constantly present. If you tell someone everything about yourself immediately, there may be less left for curiosity. But when someone reveals themselves gradually, when they have depth that isn't obvious at first, the mind has something to explore. This doesn't mean you should deliberately become mysterious. It doesn't mean you should play games. It doesn't mean you should ignore people to make them chase you. Those strategies can create attention. But attention isn't the same thing as meaningful memory. Real memorability comes from depth. A person becomes difficult to forget when there is more to them than what was visible on the surface. Maybe they had a way of listening that made you feel unusually understood. Maybe they asked questions that nobody else asked. Maybe they remembered a tiny detail you had forgotten you mentioned. Maybe they didn't need to fill every silence. Maybe they had a calmness that made you feel calm too. These moments may seem small while they are happening. But emotional experiences don't need to be dramatic to become powerful memories. Sometimes the smallest moments become the ones we remember years later. You might not remember the entire conversation, but you remember the way someone looked at you when you were struggling. You might forget exactly what they said, but you remember that they didn't interrupt you. You might not remember what you were wearing, but you remember sitting beside them in silence and somehow feeling safe. That's because memory isn't simply a recording of events. It's connected to meaning, and people who give us meaningful emotional experiences often become attached to those memories. There's another reason certain people stay in our minds. They change the way we see ourselves. This is one of the deepest forms of influence another person can have. Imagine meeting someone during a difficult period in your life. You don't feel confident. You don't know what direction you're going in, you doubt yourself. And then this person sees something in you that you weren't able to see. Maybe they tell you very simply, you're better than you think you are. At the time, you might barely react, you might even dismiss it, but months later, you're doing something you once thought you couldn't do, and suddenly you remember them. Not because of the exact sentence, but because they became connected to a turning point in your life. That person didn't simply enter your story. They became part of the story you tell yourself about who you became, and those people are difficult to forget. Because forgetting them can feel almost like forgetting a part of your own journey. This is why some people remain important even after the relationship itself is over. The relationship may have ended, the conversations may have stopped, the circumstances may have changed, but the influence remains, and influence can survive proximity. You don't have to stay in someone's life to remain part of their internal world. Sometimes, the strongest impact you have on someone happens quietly, in moments they never tell you about. Maybe you encouraged them once. Maybe you listened when nobody else did. Maybe you treated them with respect during a moment when they expected judgment. Maybe you walked away when staying would have caused more damage. Years later, they may not remember every detail, but they may remember the feeling. This person treated me differently. And that feeling can stay. There's also something strangely powerful about people who know when to leave, not dramatically, not with threats. Not with a final speech designed to make everyone feel guilty, just peacefully. They recognize when something no longer works. They recognize when their presence isn't valued. They recognize when a relationship has become one-sided, and instead of constantly demanding to be chosen, they choose themselves. That can be difficult for people to understand, especially when they're used to someone always coming back, always explaining, always apologizing, always trying one more time. When that person finally stops, the silence can feel louder than all the previous conversations. And this is where many people misunderstand what makes someone memorable. It's not the act of disappearing. It's the meaning behind the disappearance. If someone leaves simply to manipulate you, you may remember the behavior, but you won't necessarily remember them with warmth. You may remember the frustration, the confusion, the game. That's different. Leaving becomes powerful when it represents something authentic: self-respect, acceptance, growth, a boundary. A recognition that something has reached its natural ending. When someone leaves without destroying everything behind them, their absence can carry a strange dignity. You may not agree with their decision, you may even be angry, but somewhere inside you understand it. They weren't trying to punish you, they simply stopped abandoning themselves. And that can be difficult to forget. There's another quality that makes people memorable: consistency, not perfection, consistency. There is something deeply reassuring about someone whose behavior matches their words. If they say they'll call, they call. If they say they care, you can feel it in how they behave. If they disagree with you, they don't suddenly become cruel. If they are angry, they don't use your deepest insecurities as weapons. You know where you stand with them. And that kind of emotional consistency creates trust. But here's the interesting part. Sometimes you don't realize how valuable that consistency was until it's gone. While someone is present, you may barely notice the stability they provide. Then they leave, and suddenly you realize how much emotional noise there is without them. You begin comparing other interactions to the way it used to feel, not consciously. It just happens, someone else interrupts you, you remember the person who used to listen. Someone else disappears for days, you remember the person who always communicated clearly. Someone else makes you feel like you have to prove your worth. You remember the person who never made you audition for their attention. And this is how a person can remain present without physically being present. Their behavior becomes a reference point. You carry the standard they showed you, and sometimes that's one of the greatest ways a person can leave a mark, not by making you dependent on them, but by teaching you what healthy connection can feel like. Of course, not every memorable person is someone we miss. That's important. Some people stay in our memory because they hurt us. A betrayal can be unforgettable. A humiliating moment can be unforgettable. A relationship that made you question your worth can remain in your thoughts long after it ends. So being remembered isn't automatically a sign that someone was good for you. Memory doesn't judge morality, it records significance. That's why someone can be unforgettable and still be someone you should never return to. Sometimes the person you remember most is the person who taught you what you will never tolerate again. And that's still a form of influence, but there is another kind of memorability, the kind created by emotional safety. Think about the people around whom you didn't have to perform. You didn't have to be impressive. You didn't have to carefully choose every word. You didn't have to pretend you were okay. You could be quiet. You could be uncertain. You could admit you were wrong. You could laugh at yourself. You could simply exist. Those people are rare, and when rare experiences disappear, we notice. Because the brain pays attention to experiences that feel unusual. If most of your relationships require effortful performance, but one person makes you feel completely natural, that contrast matters. And after they leave, you may find yourself missing not only them, but the ease you experienced around them. That's a subtle distinction. You might think, I miss that person, but underneath that thought may be another one. I miss who I was when I was with them. And sometimes that's the real reason someone stays in your memory. They gave you access to a version of yourself that felt honest. Maybe you were more playful, more confident, more curious, more peaceful, more open. And after they leave, you notice that version of yourself becoming harder to reach. So your mind returns to the person, because your mind associates them with that version of you. This is also why certain friendships from childhood can remain emotionally powerful decades later. The friend isn't simply a person. They're connected to a time when you were becoming yourself. They carry memories of who you were before adulthood changed you. They remind you of a version of life that no longer exists. And sometimes, what you miss isn't the person, it's the time. The innocence, the possibility, the feeling that life was still wide open. People become containers for memories. That's why a person can disappear from your life and still appear in your mind whenever you encounter the world they were connected to. A certain neighborhood, a particular restaurant. A familiar phrase, a season, a holiday, a song, a smell. Memory doesn't always say, remember this person. Sometimes it simply recreates the emotional environment in which that person existed. And suddenly, there they are. This is why you don't need to constantly remind people of yourself to remain memorable. In fact, constantly reminding someone that you exist can sometimes have the opposite effect. Familiarity can reduce emotional intensity, but genuine experiences don't need constant maintenance. If someone truly affected you, you may remember them years later without ever seeing their name. That is the difference between attention and impact. Attention requires presence. Impact can survive absence. And perhaps that's the most important distinction in this entire idea. You don't become unforgettable by trying to control someone's memory. You become memorable by being fully present when you're actually there. Listen deeply, pay attention, say things that are honest, let people see something real about you. Don't perform a personality just because you think it will make you more attractive. Don't manufacture mystery. Don't deliberately create jealousy. Don't disappear just to test whether someone cares. Those things may produce reactions, but reactions are not the same as connection. If you want to leave a meaningful impression on people, give them an experience of you that is genuine. Maybe it's the way you listen. Maybe it's your ability to make someone laugh when they desperately need it. Maybe it's your calmness during conflict. Maybe it's the way you encourage people without making them feel weak. Maybe it's the way you walk away from disrespect without becoming disrespectful yourself. Maybe it's simply the fact that when someone was talking to you, they felt like they actually had your attention. These things sound ordinary. But ordinary moments are where most of human life happens. We don't usually remember the grand speeches. We remember the small moments that carried emotional meaning. The person who stayed beside us when we were embarrassed. The friend who called when everyone else assumed we were fine. The stranger who showed kindness on a terrible day. The person who challenged us when we needed honesty more than comfort. The person who believed in us before we believed in ourselves. And sometimes, the person who left. Because their leaving forced us to become someone different. That's another uncomfortable truth. Not everyone who leaves your life is taking something away from you. Sometimes their departure creates space. Space to grow, space to think, space to discover what you actually want, space to become independent, space to stop chasing something that was never balanced. And later, when you look back, you may realize that the person who left still played an important role in your life, not because they stayed forever, but because they were there long enough to change something. That's enough. Not every meaningful person is meant to remain. Some people are chapters, some are turning points, some are mirrors. Some are warnings, some are lessons, and some are simply beautiful memories. The mistake we make is assuming that if someone is no longer in our life, their significance must have disappeared too. It doesn't work that way. Human beings carry invisible histories. Every person you have loved, trusted, lost, forgiven, or outgrown leaves something behind. A phrase you still use. A boundary you learn to create, a standard you now expect, a fear you learn to overcome, a part of yourself you discovered. We are constantly becoming combinations of the people and experiences we've encountered, and that's why someone can leave your life without completely leaving you. But there's something else worth considering. If you want to be remembered well, don't focus on being impressive. Focus on being real. Impressive people attract attention. Real people create connection, and connection is what memory often holds onto. Think about the difference between someone who spends an entire evening talking about themselves and someone who makes you feel comfortable enough to talk about something you've never told anyone. Years later, you may not remember everything that second person said, but you'll remember how safe you felt. That is emotional memory, and it is often stronger than simple factual memory. The same thing applies to confidence. True confidence doesn't need to announce itself. Someone who is comfortable with themselves doesn't constantly need to prove their intelligence, status, attractiveness, or importance. They can walk into a room without demanding that everyone notice them. They can leave a conversation without needing the last word. They can disagree without becoming hostile. They can receive criticism without completely collapsing, and that kind of quiet stability can be surprisingly memorable because it is rare in a world where so many people are performing. Someone who is simply comfortable being themselves stands out, not loudly, quietly, and sometimes quiet things stay with us longer. You might forget the loudest person in the room, but remember the one person who looked at you and seemed to actually understand what you weren't saying. That's the kind of presence people carry, not because it was dramatic, because it was meaningful. And perhaps that's why the people we remember after they leave are often the ones who gave us something without demanding that we give something back immediately. They gave attention, understanding, honesty, encouragement, respect, or simply a moment where we didn't feel alone. That kind of experience becomes emotionally valuable, and when it disappears, the mind recognizes the difference. So if someone from your past still crosses your mind sometimes, don't immediately assume it means you should go back. Memory is not always a direction. Sometimes it's simply a reminder that something mattered, a reminder that you changed, a reminder that you loved, a reminder that you were once a different version of yourself. You can remember someone without reopening the door. You can appreciate what they meant without needing them back. You can carry the lesson without carrying the pain. And you can let a memory remain a memory, because moving on doesn't require forgetting. Sometimes moving on means remembering without being controlled by what you remember. And if you're wondering how to become the kind of person people remember after you leave, the answer is probably much simpler than you expected. Don't try to be unforgettable, try to be genuine. Don't try to create mystery, create depth. Don't try to make people chase you. Give them a reason to feel safe around you. Don't force your absence to create value. Let your presence have value on its own, And when something has genuinely reached its end, have enough self-respect to let it end without destroying what was good about it. Because the people who leave the deepest impressions aren't always the ones who stayed the longest. They're the ones who were fully there while they were there. They listened. They noticed. They cared, they challenged us, they made us laugh, they made us think. Sometimes they broke our hearts, sometimes they helped us rebuild them, and eventually life moved forward. But somewhere inside us, a small piece of that experience remained. Maybe that's what it really means to be remembered, not that someone thinks about you every day. Not that they secretly want you back, not that they can't move on. It means that your existence became connected to something meaningful in their life. And meaningful things don't always disappear when people do. Years from now, someone may hear a song and remember the way you laughed. They may walk into a familiar place and remember a conversation you had. They may face a difficult decision and remember something you once told them. They may meet someone who treats them badly and suddenly realize how differently you treated them. You may never know, and that's the strange beauty of human influence. You don't always get to see the impact you have. Sometimes you leave a room thinking nothing important happened, while someone else walks away feeling understood for the first time in months. Sometimes you think a conversation was ordinary, while the other person remembers it years later. Sometimes you think your story with someone ended when you said goodbye, when in reality, something you gave them continued long after you left. So maybe the goal isn't to make people remember you. Maybe the goal is to live in a way that makes your presence meaningful while you're there, and your absence honest when it's time to go. Because eventually everyone leaves, people move, friendships change, relationships end, jobs disappear, cities become unfamiliar, life keeps taking us into new chapters. You won't remain in everyone's life forever, and you don't need to. What matters is what existed while you were there. Did people feel seen? Did they feel respected? Did they feel safe enough to be themselves? Did you make them think? Did you help them grow? Did you leave them with something good to carry forward if you did? Then you may have already left more behind than you realize. And perhaps one day, long after you've stopped thinking about someone, they'll remember you. Not because you tried to haunt their memory. Not because you made them chase you. Not because you disappeared strategically. But because, for a certain moment in their life, you were real, you were present, and you mattered. Maybe that's the deepest truth about being remembered after you leave. People don't always remember the person who tried hardest to be unforgettable. They remember the person who made them feel something real. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can leave behind isn't your name. It's a feeling, a lesson, a moment, a change. A version of themselves they discovered while they were with you. So when you eventually walk away from someone's life, walk away with peace. Don't spend your life wondering whether they'll miss you. Don't measure your worth by whether someone comes looking for you. And don't confuse being remembered with being loved. Your worth was never supposed to depend on occupying someone else's thoughts. Live deeply, love honestly, listen carefully, set your boundaries, give people your presence when you're there. And when it's time to leave, leave without losing yourself. Because the right people won't remember you because you forced yourself into their memory. They'll remember you because, for a little while, life felt different when you were around, and even after you were gone, some part of that difference remained. If this made you look at human behavior a little differently, keep exploring these deeper conversations with Next Mindcore. Because sometimes the most interesting things about people are the things they never say out loud, and sometimes the people who leave your life are the ones who quietly teach you the most about yourself.